With the vote that just happened, the FCC is moving one step closer to distributing $9 billion for rural 5G over the next decade and subsidizing carriers to serve areas that they normally couldn't afford to. What's your position on this? How big an issue do you think the lack of access in rural and poorer areas is?
Yeah, this is the single biggest effort to date to truly close the digital divide as we look to get 5G built out. There's a number of carriers, T-Mobile, for instance, that's committed to bringing 5G to 99% of America. That's great. And now this funding is going to help make sure that every single community gets a fair shot at 5G because the stakes are just too high to have a gap there when it comes to this next gen infrastructure.
We actually put together a map that shows connectivity issues across the country. The darker areas show where the most people don't have access to the internet, and it is kind of shocking to see how many people out there just can't get online or maybe don't even have access to a computer, especially at a time when you've got so many people working from home, students at home with schools closed. How big a concern is it that we might come out of this pandemic with greater inequality and a larger digital divide or homework gap, if you will, just given the circumstances out there?
The stakes truly are high. As you point out, more Americans than ever before are relying on the internet, whether it's working from home, educating our kids, telehealth. And so I think we're taking a lot of concrete steps right now to close that digital divide. Over the first 2 years of this administration, we narrowed the digital divide by about 30%. Internet speeds are up. So we're making great progress, but we are not flying the mission accomplished flag just yet. I think as this pandemic shows, that's why this new $9 billion, putting that into the ground, building out internet infrastructure, closing the divide is going to be so important.
The FCC has gotten broadband providers to pledge not to cut off service for 60 days. That was in mid-March. So we're about halfway through. What happens when those 60 days is up? What can the FCC do?
We're going to keep looking at it. I think the chairman has just spoken recently to that pledge. And I think it's been very, very important. We've accelerated funding. The private sector has stepped up to make sure particularly low-income Americans and students don't get cut off during this vitally important time to have internet connectivity. So I'm really proud of the work that's gone into that pledge, and I'm open-minded as to how we eventually power out of this current situation.
Do you think you can get providers to sign on to do that for another 60 days? Can you force them to do that?
We'd have to think about that. Remember, these are some of the most capital-intensive networks in the entire U.S. System. So we need to make sure that the funding is available, the capital is available to keep investing, keep building out, keep maintaining these networks. And so that's the balance we have to strike, making sure people stay online, but making sure that these internet companies continue to have access to capital to invest those dollars right back in the network.
What about expanding programs like Lifeline to get more low-income people, get to more low-income people that can't afford broadband?
Yeah, this is important. Congress is actually looking at fast tracking some additional funding to the FCC. That would be very welcome and very helpful. There's some limits on our statutory authority, particularly when you talk about that homework gap. Our funding authority is limited to supporting classrooms, which obviously doesn't make a lot of sense right now given where kids are dispersed. So there's some legislation that would give us authority to go beyond classroom funding in terms of closing that homework gap.
Now, there have been some conspiracy theories swirling about 5G that it affects people's health, causes serious health problems, causes even the coronavirus. And some of these concerns have been spreading on social media. What do you want to say to companies like Facebook and Twitter about how they should handle that? I mean, we've even seen, attacks on 5G towers, cell phone towers in the UK.
Yeah, look, a lot of these conspiracy theories, they're just coming from the deepest and darkest depths of tinfoil hat land. And what's interesting about it is it's not just coming from that part of tinfoil hat land. There are state actors that are behind this. There's been reporting about Russia being behind misinformation campaigns on 5G and health hazards because they want to sow confusion among the American populace because the U.S. is leading the world in 5G. Russia doesn't like that. So they've been using this as a technique to try to slow the U.S. down.
What would you say to companies like Facebook and Twitter, though, about this information and how they should be controlling it or monitoring it or pulling it down?
Yeah, my position on free speech on the internet is pretty clear. I believe in more speech, not less. And it's tempting to step in and say we should shut down particular speech like this. I always think the answer is let's put more speech out there, whether it's through platforms that I use like Twitter. We all need to put information out there rebutting these conspiracy theories. I'm not
Even
so convinced about.
conspiracy theories are about something as grave as a virus that can kill you.
Yeah, well, so obviously 5G is not a virus that can kill you, but to your point, if there's misinformation about COVID-19, so for instance, YouTube has said they're going to take down information that's inconsistent with WHO recommendations. My view on that is we should just put more speech out there, because at the end of the day, the people that are making censorship decisions on the internet, they are either fallible or pushing their own agenda. So I think we're far safer in the long run, even though it seems appealing in particular circumstances to censor speech like this, to let speech up there and to combat misinformation with additional factual information.
Do you think what YouTube is doing in that instance is censorship?
I have some concerns about it. Obviously, YouTube, Facebook, these are private platforms. They have wide leeway in terms of the decisions they make about what to put up and what to take down. But yeah, my 2 cents is, rather than trying to police this type of information, we should be out there putting our own information out there to counter that speech. I think I was also a bit disturbed to see some state governments that were putting pressure on Facebook to take down information about protests of those very same state governments. Again, Facebook has a lot of leeway here, but when the state government comes in and pushes them to try to take down those posts, then that does trigger some First Amendment concerns from my perspective.
The FCC has also issued a directive to various telecom operators to remove components made by Huawei. The US government has alleged that Huawei could be spying for the Chinese government. There's still been little evidence put forward that this is true. And I'm curious, have you seen some evidence that we haven't seen? Do you believe this is in fact happening? And what is the proof?
Yeah, no, I have seen information that you haven't seen. So for instance, on our decision on Huawei and ZTE, where we prohibited their subsidized equipment from going into the network, we put some public information in our document. We also had some classified appendices that laid out some additional information. I am concerned about it. Look, I've been up in Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, which is where 150 intercontinental ballistic missiles are spread across hundreds of miles of big sky country and cornfields. There's very few people up there, except there are cell towers dotted throughout that missile field running on Huawei gear. And when you look at the performance characteristics of some of the equipment out there, I think it gives you reason to have some concern. And of course, there's additional information that hasn't been publicly reported.